Sisms, a corrupt judge, betrayed his sacred duty, sealing his fate in the most horrifying way. His skin was ripped from his living body, preserved to upholster the chair where his son would one day sit, inheriting not just the role, but the curse of corruption. In the year 520 to BC, under the blistering sun of the east, the royal palace of Susa stood like a dark monument to power and fear. Within its cold, towering walls, young King Cambyses II, son and successor of the legendary Cyrus the Great, prepared to administer a justice so brutal it would carve its name into history for millennia. The court had gathered, an ominous silence hanging heavy in the air, as an old, trembling man stood before them. Sisms, a royal judge, once respected, but now doomed to a fate no one could have imagined. His fall from grace would become the stuff of nightmares, an unforgettable tale of corruption and punishment. This would not be a quiet execution, nor a private affair. No, Sism's fate would be a spectacle. The screams that echoed through the palace halls that day were not just the final gasps of a man, but the birth of a legend of the judge whose skin would be stripped from his body, while still alive, used to upholster the chair of his own son, who would follow in his footsteps. How did such a revered figure fall so far? To understand, we must look back at the moment of his fatal mistake. In the sprawling Persian Empire, judicial power was sacred. Judges were the voice of the king, untainted and incorruptible. But Sisms succumbed to the whisper of gold and power, bribed by a noble whose case he had been appointed to judge. His decision would prove to be his undoing. As a loyal scribe exposed his corruption to King Cambyses, Cambyses, ruthless and determined, did not hesitate. He made an example of Sisms, one that would be remembered long after the screams had faded into the silence of history. In the murky depths of the Persian Empire, a fatal mistake began to unravel the life of Sisms, a royal judge whose name would be forever etched in the darkest corners of history. It was a case that should have been inconsequential, a territorial dispute between two noble families. But one of the nobles, knowing his legal arguments were fragile, turned to a far more sinister solution. He bribed Sisms, slipping a generous sum of gold into the judge's hands, corrupting him with the promise of wealth. The judge, blinded by temptation, believed the case so minor that King Cambyses, distracted by his military campaigns and consolidating his reign, would never notice. With a tainted mind and a corrupted soul, Sisms delivered a verdict that was unjust and swayed by the gold that now filled his pockets. What Sisms could not foresee was the ever-watchful eyes of the Persian Empire. Beneath the veneer of power, there was an intricate web of spies, informants, and loyal subjects. Among the witnesses in the courtroom that day was a scribe, devoted to the nobleman wronged by Sism's biased decision. The scribe, driven by a deep sense of justice, gathered the damning evidence of the bribe and secretly presented it to King Cambyses, who had just returned from a brutal campaign in Egypt. Cambyses, known for his unyielding ruthlessness, was no stranger to the ways of power and control. The son of Cyrus the Great, he inherited not only the throne, but his father's unrelenting vision. Determined to establish his reign with an iron fist, Cambyses would not let corruption stain his empire. Upon learning of Sism's betrayal, the king wasted no time. He ordered the judge's arrest and summoned the entire court to witness the trial. The atmosphere in the palace was thick with dread as Sisms, trembling and broken, was dragged into the hall. The court watched in grim silence as evidence was laid bare. The judge, forced to confront the undeniable truth of his corruption, confessed. But his confession was not enough to calm the fury of Cambyses. The king's wrath was not merely personal, it was a message to the entire empire. With cold precision, Cambyses passed his sentence, death by flaying. This was no private execution, but a public spectacle, meant to instill fear into the hearts of those who dared to tarnish the purity of Persian justice. And so, the punishment began, marking the end of Sisms and the beginning of a terrifying legend. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. One subscribe from you will be a huge encouragement for us to grow the channel and create even better content in the future. A heartfelt thank you to my dear friends for quietly watching my videos. The punishment that awaited Sisms was not merely a sentence, but a macabre lesson that would echo through the centuries. a twisted reminder of the consequences of corruption. In the dark heart of the Persian Empire, where power and brutality danced together in the shadows, the punishment was designed not only to end the judge's life, but to etch a permanent mark on history. The skin of the corrupt judge would not be buried or destroyed, it would become part of a new, horrifying legacy. It would upholster the chair of justice that would be occupied by his son, Otanes, who would inherit his father's role as judge. On the fateful morning, the courtyard of the palace was packed with nobles, merchants, scribes, and foreign diplomats, each summoned to witness what was to be an unforgettable display of royal justice. Sisms, broken and trembling, was dragged forward in chains, his once proud dignity shattered by the knowledge of the unspeakable horror that awaited him. In the center of the courtyard, a wooden table stood, surrounded by braziers, where the executioner's tools were heated and ready. The Persian method of flaying was a grim art, executed with horrifying precision. The victim was kept alive, the skin peeled from their body slowly, agonizingly, piece by piece. Sisms would endure hours of torment, his screams reverberating through the palace halls. The executioners worked with an eerie calmness, making careful incisions along his back, chest, and limbs. Hot water was poured over his skin to soften it, and with spatula-like tools, they began their grim work, peeling the skin from his flesh inch by inch. Those present recoiled in horror, some fainted. Others turned away, unable to bear the sight. But Cambyses, standing cold and unmoved, watched with the detachment of a ruler determined to make an example of the judge. Sism's suffering was drawn out, lasting for hours, his body losing blood, warmth, and life as the executioners continued their work. His death came not from a single blow, but from the slow, tortuous combination of shock, blood loss, dehydration, and hypothermia. Yet, Sisms remained conscious through much of it, a living witness to his own punishment, fully aware that his skin would be turned into leather, to be used as a permanent reminder of his crime. After his death, the skin was treated with salt and preservatives, then stretched over the chair of justice where his son would one day sit. His father's crime would now serve as a perpetual lesson. The image, almost unimaginable to modern sensibilities, would haunt the minds of those who dared to witness it. A son, forced to sit every day upon the skin of his own father, administering the very justice his progenitor had so thoroughly corrupted. This grotesque legacy of punishment was not an act of gratuitous cruelty, but rather a calculated, chilling reminder embedded within the heart of Persian tradition. In that ancient world, positions of great power, like that of royal judge, passed from father to son. Otanes, the son of the disgraced Judge Sisms, was already being prepared to inherit his father's role, unaware that his inheritance would forever be stained with blood and suffering. His father's skin, flayed from his body while still alive, would become the upholstery of the very chair in which Otanes would sit. The horror did not end with the execution. It was crafted to endure, to haunt, and to teach. The punishment was not merely the execution of a corrupt judge, it was a message, a grim symbol intended to instill a deep fear of corruption in all who sought positions of power. Cambyses, ever the son of the ruthless Cyrus the Great, did not merely administer retribution, but created a legacy. As Cambyses himself remarked to Otanes during the ceremony where he assumed his father's place, "Always remember upon what leather you sit when pronouncing your judgments," a chilling reminder, indeed, that justice could not be compromised without paying the ultimate price. Otanes, now bound by this unspeakable reminder, was left to grapple with his psychological torment. How could a man who sat upon such a chair ever escape the shadow of his father's fate? Herodotus, the ancient historian, tells us that Otanes eventually rose to power as a satrap, a provincial governor in Ionia, but we are left to wonder what thoughts lingered in his mind each time he took his seat. Did he see his father's skin as he sat in judgment? Was he haunted by the screams that echoed from the past? Or did he, like so many men of power, eventually come to accept it as part of his legacy, a legacy forged in brutality and fear? The story of Sisms would not be confined to the whispers of the Persian court. It would reverberate through the centuries, transforming into a symbol of corruption that transcended time. Nearly 2,000 years later, during the Renaissance, European artists rediscovered this dark chapter of history. Among the most famous depictions is the Judgment of Cambyses, a monumental diptych painted by the Flemish artist Gerard David in 1498. Commissioned by the alderman of Bruges, the painting was to be displayed in the town hall, a grim reminder of the dangers of judicial corruption. The upper right panel of the artwork is the most chilling Otanes seated on the throne, his father's flayed skin stretched across the seat beneath him. This grotesque detail, while small in the composition, is laden with meaning. It is not a mere decoration but a lasting symbol, an eerie reminder of the consequences of betrayal in the name of justice. The choice to depict this theme in such a prominent location was no accident. During the Renaissance, the image of schisms was transformed into a powerful cautionary tale. It was no longer just a piece of history. It became a stark warning to those in positions of power that corruption would always be remembered, always punished. Throughout Europe, in places where judges and public officials worked, reproductions of the Judgment of Cambyses were hung as daily reminders of the consequences of corruption. Other artists, too, captured the horrific scene. One such artist, William Isaac van Swanenburg, created an engraving in 1671 based on a drawing by Joachim Vevey. It depicted Cambyses commanding the flaying of schisms, with Otanes, once a child, now forced to sit upon his father's skin. The image, just as powerful as Gerard David's painting, carried a message that could not be ignored. The tale of schisms had long since transcended the borders of Persia and found a home in the public consciousness of the West. Even in the modern era, the story of schisms continues to wield immense symbolic power. In 2012, during a trial of anti-government demonstrators in Moscow, protesters brought reproductions of Gerard David's painting to the courthouse, holding it high as a direct statement about judicial corruption and its dangers. The haunting image of schisms' skin, now centuries old, still spoke to the heart of justice. The execution of schisms raises profound questions about justice and punishment, particularly in the use of terror as a tool of governance. In today's world, the practice of flaying seems unimaginable, too cruel for any reason. Yet in ancient Persia, it had its own logic. Public executions served not just to punish but to educate, to serve as an example. Cambyses' decision to turn schisms' body into both spectacle and symbol, his skin now serving as a functional object. A chair for the next judge transformed the execution from a mere act of retribution into an enduring reminder. The chair, upholstered with human skin, became a permanent monument to the dangers of corruption, an object that, every day, reminded the empire's judges of the price of betrayal. And so, schisms' story endures, not just as a lesson in history, but as a chilling reminder that justice cannot be compromised, for the price is often far greater than one can imagine. In ancient Persia, the importance of impartial justice was not just a societal value, but the very backbone of the empire's stability. A corrupt judge did not simply wrong individuals. He threatened the entire foundation of the state. In a world where there were no checks and balances to restrain those in power, a judge's integrity was the only safeguard against tyranny. The story of schisms, preserved in the writings of Herodotus, serves as a chilling reminder of the consequences of corruption. The details of his punishment, while horrifying, are consistent with Persian customs. Flaying was a brutal yet symbolic execution reserved for those who betrayed the trust of the empire. Schisms' gruesome fate was more than just an execution, it was a demonstration of power, an unforgettable spectacle designed to remind all judges of the price of corruption. His skin was to be stripped from his body and transformed into something grotesque, the very chair that his son, Otanes, would one day sit in to dispense the same justice his father had betrayed. The chair, upholstered with human skin, was meant to serve as a permanent reminder of the corruption that had nearly destroyed the empire. This horrifying act of justice, however, was not an isolated incident. In a vast multi-ethnic empire where power needed constant reinforcement, public demonstrations of authority were essential. Schisms' fate became a symbol of the empire's dedication to justice. His story transcended time, growing into a cautionary tale. It was not only preserved in the annals of history, but was immortalized in art, most famously by Gerard David in his The Judgment of Cambyses. The painting, completed in 1498, depicted the tragic irony of Otanes, now seated on the chair made from his father's skin. This grotesque image haunted those who saw it, reminding them that corruption in the judiciary had consequences beyond the individual. The story of schisms has not been confined to the past. Even in modern times, it resurfaces as a metaphor for judicial corruption. In 2012, protesters in Moscow held up reproductions of David's painting during a trial, sending a powerful message about the dangers of compromised justice. The story of schisms endures not as a relic of ancient brutality, but as a mirror reflecting the ongoing struggles for justice and integrity. It forces us to ask, what price does corruption demand, and how far must we go to rid ourselves of its grip?